Welcome. I was having a really hard time studying for this AICP exam with note cards, sticky notes, and writing stuff down, so I really wanted to find an audio version or a compilation of everything, and I couldn't, so I figured I would just make it. So here it is. First off is the history of planning. 1909. This was the first National Planning Conference. It was held in Washington, D.C. In this same year, Harvard taught the first city planning course in their landscape architecture department. In 1912, Walter Moody published Wacker's Manual of the Plan of Chicago, adopted as an 8th grade textbook for the Chicago Board of Education, the first formal instruction of city planning below the 8th grade level. In 1914, Flavel Shirtleff wrote Carrying Out the City Plan, Shirtless Flannel, So He Carried It, the first major textbook on city planning. 1917, the ACIP, American City Planning Institute of Planners, was founded. Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. was ACIP's first president. The organization was renamed to AIP, the American Institute of Planners, in 1939. 1925 was the first published magazine issue for city planning. This is known as the Journal for today's APA. This was done by the American City Planning Institute and the National Conference on City Planning. 1934, the American Society of Planning Officials was founded, ASPO. 1971, the Code of Ethics was born. 1977, the first exam for AIP membership was administered. 1978, American Planning Association was created through the merger of AIP and ASPO. 1981, the first actual publishing of the APA Journal. Now books and publications. How the Other Half Lives, Jacob Riis, published in 1890. This book resulted in housing reform in New York City. Tomorrow, A Peaceful Path to Reform, Ebenezer Howard, published in 1898. This book initiated the Garden City movement. Wacker's Manual of the Plan of Chicago, Walter Moody, published in 1912, the first textbook for 8th graders in Chicago. Carrying Out the City Plan, Flavel Shirtleff, 1914. The first major textbook on city planning. Cities in Evolution, Patrick Geddes, 1915, a book that centers on regional planning. Planning of the Modern City, Nelson Lewis, 1916. Local Planning Administration, Ladislas Sigaud, published in 1941. This was the first Green Book series produced by the International City County Management Association. Urban Land Use Planning, F. Stuart Chapin, published in 1957, a common textbook on land use planning. Image of the City, Kevin Lynch, 1960, a book that defines basic concepts within the city such as edges and nodes. The Death and Life of Great American Cities, Jane Jacobs, 1961. Jacobs provided a critical look at planners and planning, with a special focus on the mistakes of urban renewal. Silent Spring, Rachel Carlson, 1962, focusing on the negative effects of pesticides on the environment. The Urban General Plan, T.J. Kent, 1964. With Heritage So Rich, edited by Alfred Raines in 1966. Historic Preservation. Design with Nature, Ian McHarg, published in 1969, focusing on conservation design. The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces, William White, 1980, a book that promotes the use of environmental psychology and sociology in urban design. And now on to Acts and Ordinances. The Land Ordinance of 1785. This provided rectangular land survey of the Old Northwest, completed at the end of the Revolutionary War and provided a systematic way to divide and distribute land to the public. The Homestead Act, 1862, provided 160 acres of land to settlers for $18 and a guarantee of 5 years of residence. This led to the settlement of 270 million acres, which is 10% of the land area in the United States. The General Land Law Revision Act, 1891. This was passed by Congress to provide the President of the United States the power to create forest preserves by proclamation. The Forest Management Act, 1897, passed by Congress, allowed the Secretary of the Interior to manage forest preserves. The U.S. Reclamation Act, in 1902, it allowed the funds raised from the sale of public land in arid states to be used to construct water storage and irrigation systems. Public Lands Commission, 1903, President Teddy Roosevelt developed this to propose rules for land development and management. The Antiquities Act, 1906, this provided federal protection for archaeological sites and also allowed for the designation of national monuments. The Resettlement Administration, in 1935, this was formed to carry out experiments in population resettlement and land reform. It resulted in the development of Greenbelt towns. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act, in 1944, this is commonly known as the GI Bill for military. It guaranteed home loans to veterans. The result was rapid development of suburbs. And next up are planning theories. First up is Radiant City by Corbusier in the 1920s. This started as Corbusier's idea of utopia, or his version of the ideal city. It represented a utopian dream to reunite man with a well-ordered environment, unlike a more contemporary city. In French, Ville Radieuse was a linear city based on the abstract shape of the human body with a head, spine, arms, and legs. This design maintained the idea of high-rise housing blocks, free circulation, and abundant green spaces. The blocks of housing were laid in long lines, stepping in and out. They had roof terraces and running tracks on the roof. The concentric ring theory was next in 1925 by Ernest Burgess. This theory was a ring model that depicted urban land usage in concentric rings, with the center being a central business district, or CBD. The nearest ring to the CBD, Central Business District, would be a mixed use of residential and commercial uses, a zone of transition. Ring number 3 would be residential only for middle class. Ring number 4 would be a higher income level, better quality home, and the largest ring would be for commuter purposes. The next theory is Brodecker City by Frank Lloyd Wright in 1932. As we know, Frank Lloyd Wright was an architect, so this concept got much criticism from the actual planners, such as Jane Jacobs, how she spelled it out in her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. This concept basically took 4 square miles and gave 1 acre to each family or home or dwelling unit. In this model, he provided a train station, a few office buildings, and apartment buildings, but it was very clear that the apartment dwellers were expected to be a small minority. The sector theory was in 1939 by Homer Hoyt, also referred to as the Hoyt model or sector model. This was similar to the Burgess model and often was considered an improved version of that. So Hoyt basically argued that cities don't develop in simple rings that happen in a similar radius from the center. Different activities happen in different areas, and as you have different transportation needs connecting those those routes that happen in sectors from the center of a city have a drastic effect on how that area develops. The multiple nuclei theory is kind of a critique on Homer Hoyt's model, where it kind of accepts that things don't happen in perfect rings from the center of a city, but they also don't continue as soon as they leave the center of the city. So they'll kind of pop up in these sort of specialized areas and come and go, but overall you will have that dispersion of higher rents the further you get out into the suburbs, better quality homes, and more intense uses towards the center with transitions as you come out, but allowing it to happen in little pockets and maybe even organically, not really defining a certain direction or path from the center. The bid rent theory came from William Alonzo in 1960 and basically acknowledges these other theories that we've already seen, but speaks really to the retail aspect and commercial aspect of people willing to pay higher rents the closer you get to a city, because it has better connection to nearby residences and people treating that as a center where they come to spend money, and it's where business occurs, so you're maximizing your effort and profitability by being there, so therefore your rents are worth more. New urbanism was brought by Andreas Duany in 1982 through his idea in Seaside, Florida, where communities are walkable, they're environmentally friendly, they have open space, the architecture is consistent with geography. It's not really just like a suburban sprawl that we kind of started to see right before all of this happened. So the urban areas that were traditionally the CBD, central business districts, weren't the most livable, so it was pulling from some of those positive attributes that people found, but placing them within a residential area. The housing and job types were all pretty well spread out at the time. I actually just spent last week in Seaside, and those houses are now definitely 1.5 million to 8 million, so I'm not sure that's the case anymore, but I guess that means it's a great example of how new urbanism works. Growth machine theory, 1987, Harvey Malach. This theory was centered around growth of economics and wanted to relax restrictions by the government and municipalities and basically give the entrepreneurs or economically savvy people kind of the power to let the city grow in the way that it works best for itself. So kind of going back to the organic growth, pave the cow path kind of approach to allowing cities to grow. The edge city theory came from Joel Giraud in 1991, and it wasn't so much of an actual theory on how cities should or could develop. Joel was actually a reporter for the Washington Post, and this was found in his book called Edge City, Life on the New Frontier, and it kind of more so documents the fact that cities are developing with these elements of live, work, and play, and not so much of a downtown area where all the commerce happens. Central place theory was introduced by Walter Christaller in 1933. Walter was a German geographer who basically said settlements happen and function as central places that provide services to surrounding areas, and there's a very factual and economically calculated way that a number of businesses can exist based on the number of surrounding population it serves. This theory is really the entire backbone for any market analysis study that's done nowadays. When you take a look at how much square footage of retail or commercial can be supported given the nearby population or even the regional area based on today's transportation options, making it a little more friendlier than it might have been in 1933 when Walter was conceptualizing this whole thing. And now different types of planning and definitions. The rational planning model. It's kind of one of the more bland approaches. So identifying the definition of the problem first. Second, identifying alternatives. Third, evaluating the alternatives. Fourth, implementation of these plans or policies. Next is monitoring the effects. So it's really just a process. Set goals, alternatives, evaluate, choose, implement, and reevaluate how well it worked. And probably start over a couple times because this is how city governments work and it takes forever and it's exhausting. Satisfice. Herbert Simon. This accepts that the human mind is limited in its ability to solve problems, so we instead choose alternatives that are good enough. We satisfice because we do not have the means to maximize our decisions. Incremental Planning, 1959, Charles Lindblom. This was from The Science of Muddling Through, where Charles Lindblom argues that people accomplish goals through a series of successive, limited comparisons, basically critique along the way, learn as you go, incremental planning. Mixed scanning is brought to us by Amite Etzioni, which is basically in between rational and incremental planning theories. So he kind of argues the fact that it's a clear-cut process. It really requires some careful, rational analysis. Advocacy Planning, 1960s, Paul Davidoff. This theory kind of puts the planners at the level of a mediator where they represent the special interest groups rather than kind of use their own brains, I guess, and keep in mind the good of the whole community. Yeah, great idea. So moving on. Transactive Planning comes after in 1973, a theory by John Friedman. This idea brings a little more credit back to the planners, where it's a conversation between the neighborhood specialists or the activists where both groups are learning, both groups are contributing, and in the end you have a better product because everyone that's specialized in each area has voiced their opinion and informed the rest of the group. This is a pretty common modern day public involvement process. Radical Planning, 1987, John Friedman. This was from his book titled Planning in the Public Domain, From Knowledge to Action. And this idea removes the local governments and city planners and just gives all the power to the people. Communicative Planning. This theory says it's not a conversation between a planner and a citizen. It is a discussion that's facilitated by planners between multiple groups, multiple stakeholders, multiple residents, and it's the planner's job to synthesize the best result out of all of the input. 2010 census changes, discontinuation of the long form. Households only receive a 10-question form, and the Census Bureau enlisted thousands of groups such as churches, charities, and other organizations to promote the importance of participating in the count. Urbanized area. More than 50,000 people must have a core with a density of 1,000 people per square mile. In 2000, 68% of Americans lived in 452 urbanized areas. Urban cluster is less than 50,000 people, but more than 2,500. Same population density of 1,000 people per square mile. In 2000, 11% of the U.S. population lived in 3,158 urban clusters. A metropolitan statistical area, or MSA, must be an urbanized area of at least 50,000 people or more, but also have a total metropolitan population of 100,000. Primary MSA, or PMSA, is a metropolitan statistical area with a total of 1 million people or more. Megalopolis, that's just a ridiculous name, so 10 million people. So we go from 50,000 to 100,000 to a million. And so this came from Gene Gottman in 1961 from a book, Megalopolis, regarding the 300-mile-long urban area between Boston and Washington, D.C. A census tract is the smallest area where all of the information is released. Typically, a population is between 2,000 and 8,000. A census block is the smallest level in which census data is collected. Typically, there's 400 housing units in a census block. A census block group is just groupings of census blocks. MCD, Minor Civil Division, a unit only used by 29 states. Census county divisions are used in the 21 states that do not have MCDs. Tribal Designated Statistical Area, a unit drawn by tribes that do not have recognized land area. PPBS, Planning, Programming, Budgetary System. This was developed by the Department of Defense during the Kennedy administration, and it explicitly identifies the future implications of current budgeting decisions, and it considers all costs and analyzes alternative programs. However, ZBB, Zero-Based Budgeting, does not. It takes a fresh look at the beginning of each budget cycle to see what's needed and basically makes you argue for your money again. This was developed by the Texas Instruments in the 1970s. The Dayton system, or program strategies, is between the last two, and it's more commonly used by municipalities today, and it basically rolls over staff time into the next year's budget, stating that that's going to be a constant, and then it has additional columns for expenses for the year. Management-based budgeting is more common with private firms, developed by Peter Drucker, basically setting goals, achieving them through the allocation of resources, and incorporating performance reviews. Performance-based budgeting is very similar. However, meeting performance goals results in funding increases. A disadvantage is that it's very time-consuming to prepare the necessary measurables. A cost-benefit analysis compares the money versus the benefit to the community. A cost-effectiveness analysis compares the money versus smaller alternatives that could still bring multiple benefits to the community aside from one large project. The Gantt chart was developed in 1917 by Charles Gantt and is basically a task-oriented matrix where it has an X and Y axis used in most proposals today, where you track the completion of each task in relation to the time. Linear programming is more chronologically oriented on a single time scale. Program Evaluation and Review Technique, or PERT, illustrates the interrelationship of project tasks and is less focused on the amount of time it takes, and the U.S. Navy developed this in the 1950s. Critical Path Method, or CPM, is similar to PERT, but it works chronologically, stating that you cannot move on to the next task until the current one is completed. And now for terms relative to traffic alone. Trip generation rates, or TripGen. There's some industry standard calculators or multipliers that are used based on the type of use, and you multiply that out by the number of square footage of the proposed development and understand how many trips will be generated to the site. Level of service calculation or LOS, measures the amount of delay vehicles will experience based on the total number of vehicles on the road and the overall capacity. It's ranked A through F, A being the best, total free flow, level of service B being a reasonably free flow, and a level of service C having a stable flow. Level of service D is kind of what most communities shoot for just from a cost-benefit analysis, where you're approaching an unstable flow, but travel lanes are still handling the amount of traffic. Level of service E is unstable with some irregularity in speed and congestion, and then a level of service F where there are breakdowns in the system and some vehicles are completely locked. The bad thing about a level of service F is that it doesn't get any worse than that, so if you see this in one of your reports, you don't know how bad it is. Parking ratios, pretty standard is about 4 per thousand for commercial and retail, and then dwelling units have their own multiplier based on number of bedrooms per multifamily unit, or single family doesn't really have one, obviously. And now on to housing laws and acts. The 1867 New York City Tenement House Law. This was the first major housing code in the United States that required new tenement buildings to provide narrow air shaft between adjacent structures, windows that open into that, 2 toilets per floor, a window at least 1 square yard in each room. The New York City Tenement House Law of 1901 was called the New Law. Lawrence Vailor. This new law was vigorously enforced and required a lot of inspections and permits, and basically led to the modern day code compliance and building safety division. The Housing Act of 1934. This created the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, and expanded housing construction jobs. This also insured the private home loans and financed them over long periods of time to minimize defaults. Housing Act of 1937. This was the USHA, U.S. Housing Authority, where local government used eminent domain to acquire sites. Rent couldn't exceed the set percentage of income, and this was abolished in 1940. Again, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act is the GI Bill from 1944 that guaranteed home loans to veterans, and the result of this was rapid development of suburbs. The Housing Act of 1949 was focused on creating urban renewal. The Housing Act of 1954 expanded the urban renewal program with Title I, Section 701, establishing the first federal match funds for local comprehensive plans with communities less than 25,000 people. The Housing Act of 1959 made federal matching funds available for comprehensive plans at the metropolitan, regional, state, and interstate levels. The Housing Act of 1961 was a successor to the Housing Act of 1937, Section 221D3, that provided interest subsidies for the construction of public housing projects for low and moderate income families to rent. The Housing and Urban Development Act of 1965, or HUD, was aimed at providing rent supplement payments for those below the poverty line, private home loans at 3%, and subsidies for an additional 240,000 low-rent public housing projects. The Civil Rights Act was in 1968, and the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968 provided construction of 6 million subsidized units. Section 235 authorized HUD to subsidize monthly payments for private homes financed under FHA mortgage insurance program. CDBG is a community development block grant which is intended for low to moderate income sectors of a city. It's administered by HUD to local municipalities and is pretty much intended to rehab single-family homes, improve transportation services or health services regarding low to moderate income people, and also build sidewalks in low-income areas. The National Affordable Housing Act of 1990 brought us what is commonly known as the Home Investment or Home Partnership Program from HUD. All of the goals and objectives appear to be the same. However, HUD's website referred to this time period as a difficult time because Section 8 contracts were expiring and properties were deteriorating. Annual funds for this program are roughly $2 billion. Hope 6 came around in the early 90s. This is also a plan by HUD, and this was kind of a response to all of these deteriorating properties. So their main goal was to revitalize the worst public housing projects in the United States into mixed income developments. The program began in 92, had formal recognition by law in 1998, and by 2005 the program had distributed $5.8 billion through 446 federal block grants to cities for developments. The highest individual grant was $67.7 million awarded to the Avern Edgemoor houses in New York, New York. Hope 6 included a variety of grant programs including revitalization, demolition, Main Street, and planning grant programs. And now on to Transportation Acts. The first was the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. This is also known as the National Interstate and Defense Highway Act, or simply the Highway Revenue Act of 1956. This came about when President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the bill into law. It had an original authorization of $25 billion for the construction of 41,000 highway miles, supposedly over a 10-year period of time. It was the largest public works projects in American history through that time. Okay, and now might be a good time for a little break. Since this is digital, hit pause. And welcome back. We're continuing on with the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1962. So the overall timeline is 1956, 1962, next is 1973. In short, it required that 1.5% of these project funds to be utilized in urbanized areas of over 50,000 people. Since that's where the most amount of people are, that's where the most amount of tax dollars are coming from, they should be allocating money for that, not supporting urban sprawl. So now in 1973 they realized, okay, we need to be giving some more concern to environmental and social issues. This is how MPOs were created, which manage TIPs. An MPO is a Metropolitan Planning Organization. A TIP is a Transportation Improvement Plan. And any urbanized area of over 50,000 people automatically gets designated or assigned, or an MPO is basically created for that area to handle all planning related activities for long range, short range, and overall transportation efforts. There's a lot of coordination with DOTs, regional planning commissions, cities, counties, and MPOs report back to the state and federal level. Next, in 1991 comes the IST Act, which is the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act. This is quite a mouthful, but it basically takes all those responsibilities we just talked about, makes it a requirement for MPOs and DOTs to do these TIPs every 3 years and to have a 20-year long-range plan on record and requiring public input. And this also created the Surface Transportation Program, which is STP. Those are grants that are administered to cities or municipalities for roadway construction. And moving on to the Transportation Equity Act for the 21st century, T21 as it's otherwise known. So this required TIPs, these transportation improvement programs that outline all bridge, roadway, highway projects to be coordinated. The main word from here you need to remember is just equity, because they basically realized that constructing all these highways was completely unsustainable, and it called for a 54% decrease in highway funding for new construction. And in 2005 we get Safety Lou, which takes the T21 and adds safe, accountable, flexible, and efficient to the overall goal. Just some good adjectives, because they were realizing, holy cow, these highways are dangerous and the infrastructure was now aging and very expensive to repair. So aside from cutting the funding for new construction of highways previously, they realized they needed a new funding source to maintain these highways. So this created guaranteed funding totaling $244 billion. This was the largest surface transportation investment in the nation's history. One of the goals from this act was congestion relief, and that was kind of coined as road pricing. So this allowed roadways to be tolled so that people might take another route since it now costs money. To me, it makes the most sense because these superhighways are extremely expensive, need to be funded from somewhere, and why not the users? Finally, we have planning law. The first case is from 1876, Munn versus Illinois. 1876, we really didn't have any big events or acts or anything yet, just the Land Ordinance from 1785 and the Homestead Act from 1862, which gave those settlers 160 acres for $18. So this was the first real look at land use, where a grain operator was forced to comply with city ordinances. A court had ruled that private property becomes a public interest when it is used in a manner which affects the community at large. Common sense for us now in terms of residential versus industrial uses, but in 1876, Munn versus Illinois, this was a court case. Maybe we could think of this grain operator saying, "Oh man, why do I gotta comply with these? I'm on my own property, man." So that's Munn versus Illinois. 1876. Next, in 1908, was Cochran versus Preston, to allow the height of an apartment building to be greater than 70 feet, which was established by an act in 1904. The current building was 70 feet. He wanted to build an addition to make it 80 feet, and that was just a blatant disregard to the act that was in place, and the courts upheld it. The act was put into place for safety reasons regarding fire and buildings collapsing on each other, and how densely populated can areas get, and a play on words. I'm not sure who was who, but it was kind of a dick move to build the addition with that in place, and the city of Baltimore pressed on. So Cochran versus Preston, 1908. 1 year later, Welch versus Sawsey, 1909. This case upheld a Boston law that differentiated height restrictions between commercial and residential areas. Common for us now, but at the time it was a Supreme Court case. This was also a challenge to the Act of 1904, limiting the heights of buildings in certain quarters of a city, and the overall ruling was that this act and those restrictions do not violate the Constitution of the United States. Mr. Welch owned a residential building in Boston that was 100 feet tall, and nearby commercial areas could have a building up to 125 feet tall. So he just thought he could build a 124-foot building and be okay. And when his permit got rejected, he sued the city because he said it's pretty much the same thing. So play on words, Mr. Welch must have been belching because he was so drunk, because it clearly said 100 feet for residential buildings. Sorry, you lose. 1912, Eubank versus the City of Richmond. This was a case where a city ordinance in Richmond was overturned because it enabled a set of property owners the right to impose regulations they saw fit on their neighbors. This wasn't really a case on the legitimacy of the restriction, just the fact that regulatory authority cannot be delegated to private citizens. So let's just pretend that these wealthy people were trying to tell their neighbor what to do, and they were actually going by the ordinance, but these people that were getting their setbacks imposed on were saying to themselves, no, 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 you bank with money, we are rich in mind, and we use the law on our side. So they won. Next was 1915, Hadachek versus Sebastian. And what seems like a pretty straightforward zoning and land use issue really sounds pretty sketchy when you get into the details of it. What basically happened was a councilman in Los Angeles moved that the city council eliminate all brickyards in a certain area in town with the boundaries established. The only issue was this councilman owned large amounts of property in the area, and he was trying to refer to doing his civil duties to clean up the area by ridding these brickyards, but there was clearly some sort of financial gain, which was called out in the newspapers. So the city council supported the decision to not allow brickyards in this area, and this Hadachek brick manufacturer was convicted of a misdemeanor for a violation of city ordinance. So he contested it. It went to the California Supreme Court, where it was actually upheld, stating that Mr. Hadachek was not being deprived of his ability to make bricks because the rich clay soil on the property could be excavated and taken elsewhere to make the bricks. It was then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, where they upheld the decision as well. The basis for the U.S. Supreme Court's decision also lent on the fact that nothing was being taken from Mr. Hadachek because he still had his land with the rich clay and he could extract that and still make bricks. It was simply that the city of Los Angeles was correct in removing that land use from that area to clean up the neighborhood. Sorry, Mr. Hadachek. 1917 was Tomac-Cusick Company versus the City of Chicago. This case upheld the law that community members could vote on matters near to their property. This kind of goes against the previous two cases. However, the Supreme Court found that fires had been starting around the base of billboards because of the accumulation of combustible material. They also noted that offensive and insanitary accumulations are habitually found around the base of them, and they afford a convenient concealment and shield for immoral practices and for loiterers and criminals. In 1920, the case of the town of Windsor, Connecticut versus Whitney was the first zoning case in the United States that established the setting of building lines is not the confiscation of private property. This came about from a private development that was required to provide additional space for public right-of-way, and they considered that to be a takings because it was something the city was forcing them to do as part of the development. 1921 was Romar Realty versus the Board of Commissioners. This case overturned a law which was aimed at setting building heights and setback lot lines solely for aesthetic considerations because they did not affect the health and safety and wellness of the public. It was found that the county commissioners were not able to impose those lot lines. 1924 was Lowell versus Stocklosa. This was the City of Lowell's Building Inspection Division upholding the land use ordinances that they had in place, and the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled in favor of the city because a city having these land use ordinances are considered constitutional. 1926 was Euclid versus Ambler Realty. Ambler Realty owns 68 acres of land in Euclid, Ohio, which was a suburb of Cleveland. And the city of Euclid was trying to prevent industrial growth from Cleveland coming into their village. So they created some zoning designations with 3 classes of height and 4 classes of area. Ambler Realty sued, saying that their property values were substantially reduced from the city making these actions. In lower court, the village of Euclid tried to throw the case out, saying that it should have gone to the zoning board prior to being sued. However, the court denied the motion, stating that the zoning ordinance did in fact constitute a taking by Euclid of Ambler's property. They stated that the ordinance was unconstitutional and aimed implicitly, if not explicitly, at preventing the colored of certain foreign races from invading a residential section. The Supreme Court agreed with the lower court's denial and dismissal motion, but they overturned the outcome of the case and sided with the village of Euclid. This was pretty early on in zoning for cities, so the Supreme Court said that the zoning ordinance was not an unreasonable extension of the village's police power and was not unconstitutional. 1928 was Washington XREL Seattle Trust Company versus Roberg. This is where a trust company that owned and maintained a philanthropic home for old people in a residential district sought to replace the structure with a larger one for the same purposes. This was denied a permit under the zoning ordinance, stating that written consent shall be obtained from owners of 2/3 of the property within 400 feet of the proposed building. The court found that the condition requiring consent of property owners was repugnant to the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. The condition being void, the trustee was entitled to a permit. 1930 was Jones versus the City of Los Angeles. The City of Los Angeles created an ordinance separate from the general zoning ordinance of the city, and it restricted provisions directly towards one type of business, and that was a sanitarium or home or retreat for a person of an unsound mind or an insane person. At the time, there were 4 known businesses in this district that were in operation, and the California Supreme Court ruled in favor of Jones that the city could not place this on existing businesses. To be honest, this seems like a similar case as Hadachek, but a different ruling. I'm not sure why. Dowsey versus the Village of Kensington, 1931. This case found that there's a fine line between reasonable use of police powers to restrict lawful use of private property and takings, and determined that the ordinance stepped over the line and was deemed unconstitutional. 1931. Welton versus Hamilton. This overturned a Chicago ordinance which delegated zoning appeals to another body that had not been elected by the citizens without providing rules for standards and criteria for judgment. This is basically why we have our extensive amount of public input nowadays. 1935 was the United States versus Certain Lands, City of Louisville. This case overturned a proposed U.S. government action to secure lands through condemnation for the purpose of cleaning slums under the National Industrial Recovery Act. Courts determined that the federal government has no police powers in local land use concerns. 1936 was the New York City Housing Authority versus Mueller. This upheld a New York City action to condemn private property to place city-owned and operated housing projects on it. Housing for poor and low income is a legitimate use concern for police powers. 1938, Austin versus Older. This case upheld a Michigan city ordinance that prevented an existing non-conforming use to place a second non-conforming structure on the property. Very common today. 1946 was the people of Milwaukee versus the city of Chicago. This was a similar case where the courts upheld the right for a city to condemn slums and blighted areas for public ownership. 1949 was Ayers versus the city of Los Angeles. This case upheld the right for the LA Planning Commission to place conditions on a development during the review process. Okay, so I know this wasn't pretty much everything that there's going to be, or if you've taken the test, you think there's more. I'm sure there is. There could be more detail, but this is pretty much all the key facts that I could find. And really, for 45 minutes worth of studying, I think it's replaced about an entire day's worth of work for me, so that's a pretty good consolidation as far as I'm concerned. Hope you enjoyed. Thanks.